families running from the flames, workers collapsing in scorching heat. The era of global warming has ended, the era of global boiling has arrived.
Happy Thursday, folks. And that was Antonio Gutierrez there, kind of a glove puppet or stooge of Rockefeller / WEF / UN. All those good guys like the Club of Rome who brought us the madness over the past decades. So today I'm going to do a special on the weather. I'm going to avoid certain words and I'm just going to refer to global boiling. In general, when I'm referring to something you're all very well aware of. So we're going to start off with an article which has pulled together an incredible amount of data and references, and it's linked down below. So anyone with further curiosity can go through the incredible references, articles and posts within this article. I'll run through the high level, but you can go back afterwards and check out anything you wish. So I think this kind of closes the case for the moment. So let's get to it. So the image behind me, by the way, shows our lovely sun. And of course it shows the Earth to scale. So you can guess at a glance what drives the global boiling on our planet. And we have Milankovitch cycles, and we have water vapor, and we have sunspots, and we have cosmic rays affected by the sun that change cloud cover on Earth and have a strong effect. And we could go on all day. The problem is, how could 0.04% of a gas in our atmosphere have a dominating effect? Well, it doesn't. So we'll go through this article and we'll get into it. So here's the article. It's from the excellent Joel Smalley, but Doug Brody wrote this article. It's just featured on Joel's Dead Man Talking blog. So we'll skip through the intro and get to some of the meat of the matter. The origins are very important, but I've covered that at length elsewhere. All you need to know is it was originally, this whole thing, kind of identified by the Rockefeller Brother Fund in the 1950s as a very useful means to support going towards a global government where they and other elite would be in control. So a lot of the institutions set up were around this idea, and we'll see those shortly. We had the Club of Rome and we had the IPCC as part of the UN, and all of these are kind of Rockefeller organs of sorts, and all the other people are involved. So we'll skip the history and we'll go to why this thing is problematic, to say the least, the global boiling. And the assertion is that man-made CO2 is the main control knob, which is inherently absurd, but let's stick with it. But when we look at the actual historical record that's been reconstructed, ice core data, etc., we had many warmer periods in the past with much lower CO2. So we had the medieval warm period, the Minoan, the Roman, and we had all these eras where the temperatures were significantly higher and humans flourished, and there was no CO2 increase at the time, or high levels. So that's a kind of a refutation in itself. So in essence, the article points out the reconstruction shows the CO2 levels were much lower than now. So whatever led to this, it wasn't the ICE engines, etc. So there you have it. Dark Ages gave way to medieval warm period, a very important period. And by the way, I'll just show a clip now, which is very, very interesting from a few decades ago. Have a listen.
The week the article appeared, I was contacted by a reporter for National Public Radio. He offered to interview me, but only if I would state that the warming was due to human activity. When I refused to do so, he hung up on me. I had another interesting experience around the time my paper in Science was published. I received an astonishing email from a major researcher in the area of climate change. He said, quote, "We have to get rid of the medieval warm period," unquote. The medieval warm period was a time of unusually warm weather that began around 1000 AD and persisted until a cold period known as the Little Ice Age took hold in the 14th century. Warmer climate brought a remarkable flowering of prosperity, knowledge, and art to Europe during the High Middle Ages. The existence of the medieval warm period had been recognized in the scientific literature for decades, but now it was a major embarrassment to those maintaining that the 20th century warming was truly anomalous. It had to, quote, "be gotten rid of," unquote. In 1769, Joseph Priestley warned that scientists overly attached to a favored hypothesis would not hesitate to warp the whole course of nature. In 1999, Michael Mann and his colleagues published a reconstruction of past temperature in which the medieval warm period simply vanished. This unique estimate became known as the hockey stick because of the shape of the temperature graph. Normally in science, when you have a novel result that appears to overturn previous work, you have to demonstrate why the earlier work was wrong. But the work of Mann and his colleagues was initially accepted uncritically, even though it contradicted the results of more than 100 previous studies. Other researchers have since reaffirmed that the medieval warm period was both warm and global in its extent. There is an overwhelming bias today in the media regarding the issue of global warming. In the past 2 years, this bias has bloomed into an irrational hysteria.
So there we have it from a Senate hearing. This has come up again and again. The industry of global boiling has to get rid of the medieval warm period. Does that sound like science to you? No, it sounds like a scam, which of course it is. So this medieval warm period actually didn't last. It was fantastic and people built cathedrals all over Europe and Vikings settled in Greenland and everyone had a great time because things being a little warmer, a couple of degrees more, makes life much easier for humans and much better. But the conditions gave way to the Little Ice Age and it got so cold that ice fairs were held on the frozen River Thames and the Vikings were forced out of icebound Greenland. So modern science then started to advance and revealed that these cold periods coincided with periods of extremely low solar activity, i.e. the Maunder minimum. And you can see it here in the data, and again all of these hot links you'll have in the article below. You can go and look at all the detail, but it correlates pretty strongly. So solar activity starts to increase from sometime before the mid-18th century, start of the Industrial Revolution, and the Little Ice Age gave way then to gradual but fitful global warming. And this led to the late 20th century play-acting an alarm about global boiling, which they pretended had been caused by the man-made CO2. So it was a bit like lockdowns with COVID. You know, you put in a lockdown when you know the curve is going to turn over, and then when the curve turns over, you say, oh look, our lockdown was magical. But in any case, it was clearly related to the modern maximum of the Maunder graphic here. So the establishment just literally has fun with this, and to be quite honest, it may be the big lie, the enormous lie, but they do have fun with it as they just grab correlations and reattribute them to things which are not actually that relevant. Also, an interesting point is we're in a CO2 famine, effectively below 0.02%, which is obviously incredibly tiny, of CO2 in the atmosphere. Plants begin to die out, and hence mammals will too. But luckily, we're back up to around 0.04%, which means that we've got a much more green Earth, and NASA published on this, and we're greening all around and some of the deserts too. So this is fantastic. Now, the ClimateGate emails leaked in 2009 was an astonishing story. I remember it at the time and thinking, oh my God, can a scam be this big? This widely covered by the media for decades and to be total kind of fraud in a sense? Well, it turns out in recent months and years I've looked into it in more detail and sadly that's the way. So they said in the ClimateGate emails, again, the medieval warm period, we got to get rid of it. So the famous fake hockey stick graph of global temperatures, nothing to do with reality. There was almost no change, but in fairness, a recent kind of steady warming we've mentioned in the late 1900s, and they basically adjusted the data and cherry-picked tree rings and whatever suited them to make it look like this explosive rise had happened. So I think they actually outdid themselves. They over-egged the pudding because it's clearly absurd. And it's been proven since to be utterly absurd. And all of their leaked emails showed that they were literally cooking the books because that's what the big boys demanded. There's a great book, The Hockey Stick Illusion, which goes through huge detail on this. But again, we're going to keep it high level here. So we'll go on, then show another cut. This is from the Second Assessment Report, IPCC, in 95. And it's since been fact-checked and said that this was only a sketch. But it shows you what they believed, this huge body back in 95. They believed the reality. And here was the temperatures they were showing. And these are modelled on various different papers, like we showed you earlier. So the modern era is beginning to tick back up again, though it had a kind of a levelling out in the 70s, 80s, 90s until recently. But this is all pretty much natural. Now, the whole idea that the rising levels of atmospheric CO2 in these tiny percentages lead to dangerous global boiling is utterly debunked. And this is long, long debunked, because the temperature rises actually come before, all through history, tons of data, come before rising CO2. And the knob really is that the temperature of the sea increases, the absorption of CO2 falls, and CO2 is released from the sea and the oceans, and they are the massive repositories of CO2. So slight changes in temperature over the aeons, and the CO2 is sent out or taken back up again. That's pretty much the exact inverse of the establishment view of CO2 as a control knob of global boiling. Many papers here you can look at, and back in the 60s, 70s, things leveled off, as I mentioned, and they actually thought to be a new ice age. And there's many publications scaring us about ice ages back then. So what they're doing is they're looking at the temperature and then they're creating a narrative accordingly. Another area that's just absurd is the models for global boiling. So basically we can see here, as per Professor John Christie has said this many times, we have around a half a degree natural increase over the last, I don't know, half century or so. But all of the models, because science goes where the funding goes, science finds the conclusions or the desires of the funding, and all of the funding is predicated on there being global boiling. So the modelers all, of course, come up with crazy high models, and are always wrong. Increasingly wrong, believe it, over the decades. Again, many studies, plenty of links here, which show that the warming effect of the CO2 is already saturated. So even if it had relevance, currently at 0.04, around 400 ppm, parts per million in the atmosphere, even if that had some effect and some relevance, which is now done, right, the next 400, right, so we doubled from background 200 to 400 ppm. If we went from 400 to 800 ppm, right, which would take us many, many decades, you can see here that at 400 there's a certain property of CO2 that could cause some minor warming of no great significance to humans or the world. But if you go to 800, you can see the line superimposed, that it does not warm anymore. So what little did happen, right, and all the evidence says it's of no relevance to the world as it is, but doubling it again in the coming many decades, if we keep going normally, can't even add any more. So this is a killer piece of data that essentially will never be acknowledged by the bodies, because their existence is predicated on there being a global boiling catastrophe. If there's no real problem, which there's not, then they cease to exist. And what organizations funded by multi-billionaires and essentially bad guys ever put themselves out of existence? Come on, never. And the UN IPCC, which again is kind of a Club of Rome Rockefeller organ in a sense, that's where it came from, is only mandated to study the risks of human, not natural influences on climate. Therefore, they must only focus on human causes. Now, what does that sound like to you? Well, it sounds like utter nonsense. So if the human influence is tiny and lost in the natural rises of temperature and factors, by only focusing on the human, you'll ignore what's really happening, what's actually happening in reality. But they have been mandated to not get into the real effects. So it allows them to kind of pretend, without really saying it to the public, that it really is anthropogenic, because they're only looking at that and they think they see something. So they say, this is it. But I couldn't overemphasize how important it is that if an engineer did this in a complex problem and corrupt management told them to only look at the temperature of the magnesium process, right, then they would completely miss what was causing the problem, right? This is elementary, basic, and 100% clear as crystal fraud in my mind, because it's anti-science. So that's what they do, and it's officially in their mandate. So they ignore solar variations, planetary orbital and gravitational variations, solar ocean driven phenomena, Milankovitch cycle, water vapor, undersea volcanoes, which have huge effects, like in 2022. We had one, I'll show that shortly. They ignore everything real, and they focus on the theoretical and, of course, modelled stuff. So remember Neil Ferguson, Imperial College, Bill and Melinda money? Yeah, modelling. There you go. Now, the IPCC do kind of defend themselves and say that the total solar irradiance, TSI, over the course of the 11-year solar cycle is a small effect. And this is lying by omission, because within this small variation, there are large variations in parts of the spectrum, such as ultraviolet, which affects ozone layer, which affects global temperatures. But they basically won't go there. They won't look at the urban heat island effect. They just say it's not relevant. But they won't go there because they know they can't. And that's just around the temperature probes for the last 60, 70 years have become urbanized, and you can easily get a ton of extra temperature measured just because of all the concrete and asphalt that has sheltered and gone around them and traps the sun's heat during the day. So they've actually dismissed that effect, even though it's huge, because they know they don't want to go there. Sun's magnetic field is another highly contested kind of factor in this, but you can see how the interplanetary magnetic field lines up pretty beautifully with all the shifts of the Earth's temperature in the past. And now we've got a particular kind of warming zone of that phenomenon just about when the guys came in and said, oh, hey, it's all due to something completely different over here. This few hundred ppm of a trace gas. Yeah, it's all down to that. Okay then. The solar wind also affects Earth's climate by shielding us from cosmic rays when it's strong. So that results in reduced cloud cover and higher global temperatures, and vice versa when it's weak. The solar wind magnetic field is also a player, and there are published papers showing that when it's strong, there's reduced cloud cover, higher global temperatures, and vice versa when it's weak. And again, you can look at the links in the article, and it's all explained beautifully. I'm not going to go into detail here. Dr. Willie Soon is much vilified because he is a practical guy, very smart guy, and he has debunked so much of the IPCC's junk that at this stage it's actually comedic. But again, the urban heat island you really got to look into, because that's one of the biggest scams I've seen in my life. And the sun and planetary effects are enormous yet again, and they are not included in the IPCC's remit for obvious reasons. And a former IPCC reporter, Professor Fritz Varenholt, reached the same conclusions a decade ago, and the link to his book is there, The Neglected Sun. Another establishment, a bit of skullduggery, is the retrospective adjustment of official temperature records. And again, this is almost comical, and it smacks of desperation. So there's posts here you can look at where the Met Office in the UK had CRUT series. They tweaked, made the older temperatures lower and the more recent temperatures higher. And like, again, as I say, it's comedic, it's comical. And this outright cheating is exposed by the fact that the official US all-time high temperature records still stand in the Dust Bowl years in the 1930s, when, as even the IPCC has conceded, CO2 levels were much lower than they were now and couldn't possibly have caused it. So they have no answers, so they basically just call people science deniers. It's quite pathetic. Now, here's an interesting one I mentioned earlier, 2022 Tonga undersea volcanic eruption. And I didn't hear anything about it in the media because it's an embarrassment. So the word went out, let's not talk about this, as we've seen during the Cerveza sickness 2020 since, and all the other stuff that we get pushed at us in a deluge of utter nonsense. So I'll show a video now briefly, and you can see this enormous ejection of water vapor, which it's broadly accepted quietly did cause a significant jump localized jump in temperature. And that's what these guys like Gutierrez and all the rest of them jumped on. And even though they only expected 0.2 or 0.3 per decade, this sudden jump, when they saw it, knew it was due to the volcano and the water vapor, right? A transient effect, if you will. But they jumped on it and told us all the world has suddenly accelerated global boiling. So they don't seem to care about the next couple of years and where the temperature goes, because they've doubled down and they're all in, and they're in a race against time before more and more people realise the utter scamalicious nature of what they're at. So there's another link there, and Paul Homewood easily debunks this nonsense about 2023 being the hottest in 100,000 years. I mean, this stuff, as hopefully you see, is comical. And Tonga, by the way, just shows yet again more proof they don't want to admit water vapour is much more potent than CO2. But the global boiling nonsense, they have to keep lying and lying and lying, and they almost, at this stage, they seem to have no shame. So more great stuff in this article. The futility of net zero, it's just comical. And again, the author here gives many, many links to previous posts, which I'm sure you'll enjoy. Net zero is the most ridiculous thing me, as the top end or senior engineer, has ever looked at in my life. It is just absurd. So CO2 has a negligible impact on climate, so reducing it a bit is utterly pointless, expensive, destructive, wasting money that could be spent on proper human progress. All the wind turbines and solar panels, they're all just based on a triviality, and they're basically big business though. Follow the money, as always. And bonkers carbon capture and storage, there's articles in that too, is just an absolute absurdity. So final few bullet points the author has here. The CO2 has been rising steeply for decades, absolutely uninfluenced by any of the accords, agreements or actions taken to decarbonise. So it's inevitable, and luckily for us, it doesn't have any major impact to our future. But the guys running these scams certainly do, so they need to be stopped. The UK, as an example, just 1% of CO2 emissions. We've all seen recently that China and India are building coal-fired stations to beat the band, and they're a share of global pollution now. Pollution, which is a real thing and a real problem, but also so-called CO2, is beginning to dwarf everyone else. So it's complete pointless, even if it was kind of real, which is kind of not. The world is still 84% dependent on fossil fuels. If we even drop that a little in the coming years, we'd be in serious trouble. And after 15 painful years of money and investment, the UK is still around 80% dependent. And they've moved lower than many others. So it's a going nowhere fiction. And the UK government, recent reports said they have no hope of reaching net zero, but they don't care. It's like any politics, you just put your hands over your ears, nah, and you listen to what the big boys up top in the UN, the EU, and all these other bodies are telling you to do, and you just bloody do it. So this immiseration of the people, our politicians will continue with. They just don't care. Or some of them indeed believe this nonsense. There's some more stuff there on the intermittent wind and solar, which is nice to have, but it's of no real relevance and it's not consistent, and we're always going to need fossil fuels anyway, and they're way higher supply on our planet than people would let on. So it's a long time before we have to worry about not having them. And the EVs and heat pumps, look, people love EVs, they're a bit of fun, but with all the batteries, the mining, and with the inefficiencies, and then the servicing and repairs, etc., and they don't take into account the actual energy footprint that goes into making them. So Toyota CEO recently, I think it was, said, we're not including in these cars all of the blueprint or footprint of energy and CO2, etc., and minerals that go into making them. So in the life cycle of the car, they're saving bugger all. And most of the EVs still, of course, are getting electricity from fossil fuels anyway. So the conclusions here in the article are as you would expect. So I feel sorry for Douglas Brody as to anyone who understands this stuff, because it is kind of depressing to look at this absolute fraud taking place, stealing the world's investment resources that could have been used to better the world and pouring them down the toilet, or worse still, pouring them into the pockets of your allies, because this really is a mafia-style kind of scamalicious operation. And I'll just show on the screen now my root cause diagram for what's going on in the world. And top right, we see, of course, among all the other kind of frauds, we have this global boiling thing. And it's one of their big strategies because it undermines society, it moves money over to your partners, and it takes away autonomy and it takes away development of people in the developing world. So we're going to steal away their potential to have a lifestyle something like we can enjoy. So it's criminal and unethical on every single front. Now I'm going to finish with a clip from UK's Sir Monkton. Back around 10 years ago, I might put a link down below, and he gets it in a nutshell here. He doesn't mention that the UN is really a vehicle kind of propelled in the 1950s by Rockefeller's Brothers Fund and Kissinger and World Economic Forum, etc., etc., etc. He doesn't go back that far, but he really encapsulates the reality of what we're facing now. And remember, this was 8 or 9 years ago, I think, but have a listen.
And they got the Montreal Protocol in 1992. At the meeting at which they achieved this, Professor Dick Lindzen heard Bert Bolin of the IPCC, he was in charge of it at that time, say to him, just you wait, you see we've got this one through far easier than we ever should on the science. Now just wait until you see what we do with global warming. And this was only 4 years after the IPCC had been set up. Hardly anybody had heard of global warming at that time, but already the UN was planning to use this as a way of making itself into a global government, which is what they've been doing over the past few years, and they will hope to set the seal on that at Paris this December. And that global government will not be elected by anyone, and the CO2 storyline has purely been the pretext which they are using in order to establish a global government. In order to do that, they had to say there is a global problem and only global action can solve it. That's why they chose this CO2 thing, because it's virtually impossible to prove directly by any scientific means that CO2 cannot have the enormous effects they say. The fact that it's not likely to have the enormous effects they say is, of course, another matter altogether. And there is no likelihood now. We've now had 18 and a half years without any global warming, despite record increases in CO2 concentration. That is the problem they face scientifically, but they don't care, because by December this year they will have their climate treaty in place, which will effectively have turned the UN into what it has always wanted to be and has been scheming and manipulating to be for half a century. They want to be a global government, and after mid-December of this year, that is what in effect they will be. And nobody will elect them, nobody will have any chance to control them, but they will control the world. And it'll be like the EU on a grand scale. It'll start small, but gradually, because of the enormous power and wealth that a single global administration will have, they will grow in power and they will grow in strength, and they will gradually reach their tentacles into every aspect of our lives. This is the ultimate totalitarian global government, and it's happening because of a proposition which is essentially fraudulent.
So thank you, Lord Monkton. You put it very well there and kept it simple and accurate, factual and realism. That's what we like. That'll do it, folks. And as always, huge thanks to my Patreon and PayPal and other supporters across the world. You're the guys who make it possible for me to continue to do work, scientific analyses and geopolitical and macroeconomic and all the other things I do to simplify, get the correct messages out against a torrent of mainstream nonsense that comes from the media. So it's a very important thing, I think, and I think we're gaining ground. Awareness is rising as to the amount of utter skullduggery over the past decades, especially since 2020. And thanks so much to everyone who supports me, and indeed anyone else who can hop on. We do Patreon Zoom meetings once a month, and I do multiple vlogs with a lot of content that won't be found easily elsewhere. And yeah, great if you can continue to support me. Thank you.